Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our Fresh Forum. Now, today, Earth Fare has partnered with Counterculture Coffee to show us how to make the best cup of coffee and really beat the heat with an iced coffee. Now, for over 25 years, Counterculture has relentlessly pursued coffee perfection. Founded in Durham, North Carolina, their commitment to coffee perfection goes beyond flavor. Transparent and ethical sourcing are deeply ingrained in their business and every coffee they roast. Now, they're dedicated to environmental, social, and fiscal sustainability throughout the coffee value chain, improving the natural environment, paying premiums for their coffee, and minimizing the environmental impact. Now, they are also dedicated to education and making sure everybody can brew the best coffee at home. Now, today, Counterculture Coffee's educator, Trevor Clark, will be teaching us an easy way to make cold coffee taste just as if it came from the cafe. Now, we'll be answering questions about coffee in general, cold coffee, and brewing coffee at home. So there's a Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to put any questions in there throughout the presentation. Now, Trevor Clark is a specialty coffee professional specializing in barista education. Now, he's an authorized Specialty Coffee Association trainer and has authored and taught courses on topics from extraction science to the historical, social, and environmental importance of coffee plant varieties. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Trevor Clark. Trevor, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Laurie. We're very excited to share about cold coffee today.
Absolutely. So we're excited. So what do you have for us today?
Yeah, so today we are going to be learning how to make a very particular cold coffee brewing method that is referred to as flash brew. I know we've got people joining from all over today, but I can tell you where I'm at in Durham, North Carolina, it is scorching hot outside, and the idea of drinking warm coffee is a bit too much to take. So we're excited to really share a brew method that we love to prepare at Counterculture that doesn't sacrifice coffee flavor and really continues to highlight the inherent characteristics of the coffees that are on our menu, while also giving you just a delightful, light, refreshing cup of cold coffee.
Wonderful. Well, I'm excited. I know I love iced coffee. I know everyone on the line here, we have a huge crowd today. So let's go ahead and jump right in.
Fantastic. Let's do it. So one thing that I would love to lead today's session with is just with a distinction between flash brew compared to other methods of cold coffee brewing. Most commonly, the cold coffee that you will see in cafes, in the supermarket, what have you, is what is referred to as cold brew. Cold brew is not just a name for cold coffee, but it refers to a specific technique of extracting coffee, where you are submerging ground coffee in room temperature or cold water for anywhere from 6 to 24 hours. And by all means, I love a good cup of cold brew. It can be a really delicious treat in the middle of the summer, but cold brew does have a very particular kind of flavor that it imparts on your cup of coffee. It tends to be sort of this more mellow, full-bodied drinking experience, and it does tend to deliver this sort of chocolate-forward note that is somewhat universal across all cups in that brewing method. The other thing about cold brew that I want to mention is it just takes a long time to make. You can make it at home, and in fact, Counterculture has brew guides on how to make delicious cold brew in your own kitchen. But that said, you know, if it's 2 p.m. on a Thursday and you are looking for a cup of cold coffee and you didn't think to prepare for that the night before, you might be out of luck, right? Well, have no fear, because that is where flash brewing comes in handy. So flash brewing is a method of cold coffee preparation where we essentially take our usual recipe for preparing ground coffee, and rather than using our usual full volume of hot brewing water, we instead use only 2/3 of that volume in hot water, and then we add 1/3 of that water volume in ice. And we put that directly into the carafe or the cup of whatever you're brewing into. Okay. Now, flash brewing as a method will work whether you are making coffee in like your standard kind of like auto drip coffee maker like your Mr. Coffee in the kitchen, or if you want to use a pour over. So today I am going to be demonstrating how to make a flash brew pour over. And we're just going to walk step by step through that process and talk about the results here. So before we get into the brewing itself, I want to stress that there are 3 core things that we want to make sure that we have on hand. One, of course, is delicious, fresh, whole bean coffee. The coffee that we're going to be using today is one of Counterculture's 7 year-round blends, and this is a coffee called Apollo. Now, while Apollo is available year-round, we always source this coffee from Ethiopia. These are always going to be what we call wash processed Ethiopian coffees that tend to deliver a kind of citrus, floral, and silky characteristic in the cup. This is pretty typical of Ethiopian coffee, and we're really happy that we can just offer this, light, bright cup year-round. Additionally, when it comes to Apollo, this is what we would consider a medium roast. It is on the lighter end of a medium roast, but gives you a little bit of roast flavor without forgoing all of those inherent characteristics of the coffee. So, of course, we all knew we needed coffee for that. Next up is we need a scale. So I'm going to be using this super fun, vibrant pink scale today. But coffee really comes down to being all about ratios. Whenever you are preparing coffee, you want to make sure that you have the correct volume of coffee compared to the brewing water that you're going to be using. We won't dive too deeply into this, but the recipe that I'm going to use today is using 30 grams of coffee, and I'm going to use 335 grams of hot water to 165 grams of ice. So in other words, it's 30 grams of coffee to 500 grams of total water weight. And last but not least, we want to have a grinder. Now, as I mentioned, we are exclusively offering whole bean coffee. So anytime you get Counterculture, you will need to grind it. Now, you can grind this in a lot of places, but we always say fresh is best. So I've got a handy little home coffee grinder here called a Baratza grinder. It is important to buy what is called a burr grinder, which is where you have 2 different blades that can have their spacing changed so you can control the particle size of your coffee grounds. We won't get too deep into any of that, but it's important to lay that foundation. So last but not least, we are going to just be preparing this by way of a pour over. So I've got a carafe as well as a flat bottom pour over brewer here called a Kalita Wave. Again, you can use absolutely any brewing method you want. If you elect to brew a pour over, you will want a nice gooseneck kettle too, and you'll want to make sure that your water can be heated between 195 and 205 degrees. So we've got the technical details out of the way. I am going to go ahead and take 30 grams of my Apollo whole bean coffee, and I'm going to grind it. I grind this coffee to what I would consider a medium fine grind size, and that is really going to give us just the best flavor results here. So I'm going to mute for just a few seconds as I grind this coffee.
And while Trevor is grinding the coffee, again, Counterculture is great, just making sure everyone is educated on how to make the perfect brew. So they have some brew guides on their website, and you can visit counterculturecoffee.com for all of those guides, and it'll show you exactly how to make this flash brew here. And we'll also be putting a link into our email with this video later on this week. So we'll make sure you have all the resources that you need.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Laurie. All right, so I've got my coffee ground and it's hanging out here. We don't want to wait too long before we start brewing, but there's one other step I want to take, which is just to take the filter that is in my brewer. And I just want to give that a quick little hot water rinse so that we are removing any kind of residual papery flavor that might show up in your cup. So just let that drain through, pour off your rinse water, and now we are ready to start brewing. So as I mentioned, this brewing method is always going to entail using water that is, we're going to use 2/3 of our normal brewing water weight in hot water, and then 1/3 of that normal volume in ice. So for 500 grams as our total volume, I'm going to use 165 grams of ice, and I can just add that directly into my brewing carafe. And that way, as the coffee is brewing, it will start to melt the ice, just rapidly chilling this beverage down to a little bit below room temperature. Also, if you're ever brewing this and you forget to add your ice first, no worries, you can always add it after and it's going to be delicious as well. Great. So now I'm going to turn on my scale and I'm going to add 30 grams of my freshly ground Apollo into my pour over brewer. Shake this out so that my brew bed is nice and level. And then I'm going to start the brewing process with some 200-degree water. The first step that I'm going to do here is just to add about double the coffee weight in hot water. And this is going to do what we call the bloom. So there's a bunch of gas that kind of builds up in coffee during the roasting process. So you just want to add a little bit of water so that that coffee will kind of open up its pores and allow some of that gas to escape. This is just going to allow for us to have a more controlled brewing process once we really get going. So typically our bloom lasts for about 45 seconds. So we're going to wait just a couple more seconds, and then we're going to add our water in 2 pours. As I mentioned, our total water weight is going to be bringing the hot water volume up to 335 grams. So for the first pour that I'm doing, I am bringing my brew weight up to 200 grams. I'm going to let that draw through a little bit. And then once the level of water in this brew bed starts to drop a bit more, I'm going to add my second pour, which is going to complete my brew by bringing up my weight to 335 grams.
And Trevor, we do have a question. Are you able to translate into ounces from grams, they're asking?
Yeah, so we do use grams typically in the coffee industry just because in the volumes that we're using, it's usually a little bit better to get kind of granular. But that said, really this all comes down to ratios. So for every 1 part of coffee that you are brewing with, you want to use roughly 16 to 17 parts water. So that's kind of the best way I would approach it in ounces. You can also do a really quick grams to ounces conversion by going online and just doing a quick search. 1 ounce is about 28.4 grams. Okay. So only weirdos like me have that drilled into our minds, but you know, it's usually just a quick conversion table away. I will say this recipe, we're using just about 1 weighed ounce of ground coffee to approximately like a little more than 16 grams or a little more than 16 ounces of water in total. The one other thing I will mention on that as we're waiting for this pour over to finish brewing is just that you do always want to weigh that rather than scooping it. Coffee has a lot of factors that can change its density. So kind of like volume measurements don't give you the best idea of how to brew. Using that scale is going to be really crucial in that process.
Perfect. Thanks.
For sure. All right. So just at a little over 3 minutes, I had all of my water run through this pour over brewer. And so now we have a lovely cup of flash brewed Apollo ready to go. Putting my palm to the side of this pitcher, I can tell you it is a little bit cooler than room temperature, definitely a lot different than what I would expect for coffee that I just brewed with 200-degree water, right? And it's ready to drink. So I can just pour this over a glass of ice and take a nice sip and enjoy. Now, I mentioned some of the inherent flavor characteristics in a brewing method like cold brew earlier. Cold brew is kind of known for having this really mellow, full-bodied profile. Now, when flash brewing, typically we're going to instead get a really light, almost tea-like body. So anybody who's ever wanted to just like replace a nice glass of iced tea with some cold coffee in the summer, this is a method that's going to work really well for you. This method also allows us to extract some of the kind of brighter characteristics of the coffee. So those notes that I mentioned before, things like citrus and floral characteristics in the coffee, they're a little bit more readily available in this cup simply because we used hot water to break down or extract our coffee in the brewing process. And that's pretty much it on flash brewing. It's a pretty simple brew method. As Laurie mentioned before too, I highly recommend checking out our brew guide that is on the Counterculture website. And that will be linked again, along with a recap.
Wonderful. Well, Trevor, thank you so much. We do have some questions from the audience, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the Earthfare moderator, and we'll get started with our live Q&A.
Awesome. Sounds great.
Well, I'd love to encourage the group to submit any and all questions that you might have. They have been light thus far, so please submit your questions now if you get a chance. Let's talk about the other ingredients that you might want to add to this drink. If one likes a little sugar, would it be best to put it in the carafe with the ice?
Ooh, that is a wonderful question. So yeah, you could totally do that if you're going to stir in all of those ingredients at the end. Personally, I'd recommend just taking a little bit of your hot water and making a quick and easy simple syrup. So just use 1 part hot water to 1 part sugar, mix it up separately, and then add it into the carafe once you're done. And that'll just incorporate really well into your final drink. You'll make sure that you have all your sugar dissolved. And then you can even just batch a little bit of simple syrup for future cups too.
Thank you, Trevor. Let's talk a little bit about the caffeine. Does using flash brew change the caffeine level that you would extract from that amount of coffee?
So we can't necessarily speak to that, as there's a lot of natural variance in the amount of caffeine in coffee. That said, most caffeine does extract early in the brewing process. So really your amounts of caffeine, given all other variables staying the same, they tend to be more or less the same, just dependent on the amount of coffee that's going into your beverage. Now, again, I will just add with that a disclaimer. There are a lot of factors that impact caffeine, whether it is the way that the coffee is processed, the particular coffee variety, what have you. So always just be aware of the kind of natural variability of caffeine in your coffee.
Very helpful. Thank you, Trevor. Let's transition to a conversation around the grind of the grounds. Is coarse grind the same as the grind that they use for commercial ground coffee?
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally speaking, when you're buying pre-ground coffee, that coffee has been determined for, some of the more just common brewing methods. Oftentimes when you're getting pre-ground coffee, it is essentially designed for you to be able to make a full pot of coffee on like an automatic drip coffee brewer. Usually it is somewhere in a range that I would refer to as like medium coarse, or even just a medium grind size. Grind size is very relative, which is, it's kind of frustrating because we wish it was a little more universal, but it depends a little bit on the grinder that you're using and then all of your brewing variables that are going into making that cup as well. But generally speaking, yeah, you're talking about like a medium to medium coarse grind size. So when we're referring to a kind of medium fine grind for this brewing method, the way I typically think of this is that it's about the size of grains of like kosher sea salt. That is kind of your like average particle size when grinding for this method.
That's such a good reference. Sticking on the topic of ground coffee, when making cold brew, so that coffee is sitting on the counter for 24 hours, would you recommend using that coarse grind for that method?
Yeah, great question. I think the common knowledge has always been to grind very coarsely for cold brew, but I actually grind kind of comparably to what I would for a batch coffee maker. The thing with cold brew is that because you're using cold or ambient temperature water, the water is not as efficient of a solvent. So it just doesn't break down your coffee quite as easily. So when you grind a little bit finer, it's going to allow your water to kind of like just to extract that coffee a little bit better, just to access some of the things that are going to make for a really good cup. So all that said, I would actually grind just like a tiny bit coarser than you do for that kind of like full pot of like auto drip coffee that we mentioned before.
Very helpful. Uh, how about this flash brew method with darker or medium roast coffees that Counterculture has?
Yeah, I love that question. Really, this brewing method can work beautifully with absolutely any coffee. So we choose to pair Apollo with this method simply because we find that this is a really nice method to use when you are looking to extract like lighter roasted coffees and when you're wanting to preserve a little bit more of like the bright kind of fruit forward characteristics of your coffee. And so we kind of just double down on that by taking like a bright fruit forward blend and using that in this method. Now that said, you can put any of our other year rounds into this method and it's going to taste great, whether you like darker roast like our 46, our Colombian dark roast, gradient, coffee like hologram. Any of those brews are really going to work out really well with hologram or with flash brew. Sorry.
Yes, all right. That's all right. Sticking on flash brew for a moment, do you recommend making a larger batch? And if so, if that worked, how long could you keep that, let's say, in your refrigerator?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. So as I mentioned, you can really scale this up or down. Part of the reason I did a pour over for today's demonstration is just because it makes me, as you see here, I've been sipping on this, makes me about maybe two and change glasses of iced coffee. So it's a little bit more of just like a personal sipping size. Now that said, you can absolutely make gallons of flash brew at a time. We train a lot of cafes who we work with to use this as their method of cold coffee preparation. When it comes to hold time, all I can say is fresher is better with cold coffee and really with all coffee in general. Coffee oxidizes, so you can just kind of think about it like the way when you slice an apple, it starts to rust and it kind of loses flavor and picks up a little bit of this kind of like dull edge to it. Coffee kind of does the same thing. So generally speaking, I would try to use my flash brew day of brewing. And the beauty of that is that because the brewing method itself is so fast, it means that you don't really have to plan too far ahead. You can kind of like figure out the right volume for you and just make a pot of it every day.
All right, Trevor, that's really helpful. We have one more grinder question, and that
Sure.
is, if you don't have your own grinder at home, is the store grinder that's provided a method that you would recommend is usable?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say with grinding coffee, it's kind of the same as brewing, like fresher is better. So I would just recommend, grinding coffee as close to its use as possible. Within 10 minutes of grinding, a lot of the volatile aromatics that make your coffee just kind of like at its peak flavor will start to evaporate. So again, just as fresh as possible is always best. But that said, like, yes, I would recommend, using the store grinders. If you don't have a grinder at home, they are really high quality commercial coffee grinders that can give you a pretty good particle size. So it is certainly a good route to go.
Excellent. Let's momentarily transition to a conversation about equipment. There are questions around the French press. Do you have any expertise or recommendations or special notes to comment upon in using a French press?
Yeah, absolutely. So French press, I'm passionate about French presses. I was just talking about this brewing method earlier today, actually. When it comes to using a French press, I would say some of the most common mistakes with this brewing method are one, that you can just set it and forget it. I see a lot of people just kind of let it run for a really long time, when in reality, you typically want to aim for like a 4-minute brew time on French presses. The other kind of common mistake I see is much like cold brew, the conventional wisdom has been to grind as coarse as possible to make French press. And that's not really the best way to get great flavor out of it, because there's no percolation, right? So like in this brew method, you have water constantly flowing in the top, coming out the bottom. French press is an immersion brew, so once that water is added, it all just kind of sits there and there's not a lot of action. So you kind of need to help that coffee along in its extraction. My personal recommendation, use a medium to medium coarse grind size. I know I've said that phrase a lot, but it's just been true for all of these brew methods. Use a medium to medium coarse grind size. Time your pour or time your French press for about a 4-minute total steep time. And also use maybe just like 1 part more water compared to what you would use for like your pour over, for example. You want just a little bit more water to aid the extraction process. That's just going to help to break down your coffee a little bit more. So like instead of using 30 grams of coffee to 500 of water, I might just bump that up to like 30 to 530, something as small as that. And I think that will kind of push that extraction a little further and get you a really delicious cup.
Excellent. Talk to us about decaf coffee. There is some skepticism around the chemicals used for that process, and want to hear your thoughts on a method for decaf.
Yeah, oh boy, I love talking about decaf too. Y'all are just playing the hits right now. So when it comes to decaf, one thing I mentioned earlier is that all of Counterculture's year-round coffees are available at Earth Fare locations, and we do have one year-round offering that is called Slow Motion. Slow Motion is a USDA organic certified decaf coffee, and that is because we partner with a group called Swiss Water Process out of British Columbia in Canada to do most of our decaffeination. Occasionally we work with another decaffeinator, but they use a very comparable water process. Water processing is an organic method because it simply uses carbon filtration as well as pressurized water to extract the caffeine from your green coffee. That is probably one of the most foolproof methods of decaffeination, and it is, again, what we use exclusively for our slow motion decaf. Historically, decaf got a bad rap because of chemicals used in the process, namely one called methylene chloride that is a little bit of it has a mixed reputation, we'll say. That said, there has been some newer solvent decaffeination methods that have emerged that have shown a lot of promise. Specifically, there's one called ethyl acetate decaffeination that we work with a little bit. In that instance, ethyl acetate is used to extract the caffeine, but that ethyl acetate is coming from just the process of sugarcane refinement. It's just a byproduct of it. And ethyl acetate is a chemical that you'll see kind of pop up in more like, food science uses as well. It's commonly used as a flavoring agent to represent like a green grape flavor in the broader food industry. So all of that to say, like we're very particular about the decaf that we source. We really want to make sure that we're getting the cleanest sourcing that we possibly can. But if you're looking for a really just certified, awesome chemical-free process, I highly recommend choosing our slow motion decaf, because again, it is always going to be organic coffees done through an organic processing method.
Thank you, Trevor. Your expertise is deep and broad, and your passion is very, very evident. We really, really appreciate your time. This last question goes to Lori. Lori, can you please share with the customers where they can find Counterculture coffee products in their local Earth Fare?
Absolutely. So all Earth Fare locations carries Counterculture coffee. We have many different varieties, like Trevor mentioned, all of the year-round coffees, and they can be found right in our grocery department in the coffee section. And the great thing is we have a very knowledgeable staff on site. So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to come in and chat with our team. But Trevor, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for being here. I learned so much, and I think there's so much to learn with the whole coffee process. You know, we'd love to have you back in the fall to talk about how to brew hot coffee and some different ways to make some hot drinks. So again, thank you for being here. We really appreciate you.
Well, thank you so much for opening the floor, and yeah, we'd love to talk about hot coffee brewing once the weather cools down a little bit.
Yeah, we have to cool down just a little bit, I think. Absolutely. I think it was in the 90s today. So again, we will send out this link. So if you'd like to share it, it should be coming out in the next day or two. We'll also post this video to Earth Fare's YouTube page. Make sure to subscribe. It's at My Earth Fare. We have many different educational videos, and we'll be growing our content. But again, thanks to Counterculture Coffee and Trevor. This has been amazing, and I will see everyone at the next Fresh Forum. Bye, guys.